The golden sun bathed Thebes in its warm glow as Nefara wandered through the grand temple of Thoth. She had always been drawn to its towering pillars and ancient carvings, far more than the dusty scrolls her father insisted she study. Knowledge was sacred, but adventure whispered more sweetly in her ears. Today, something deep in her chest urged her forward, a silent pull leading her past the familiar corridors and into the temple's forbidden depths. The air grew thick with dust as she slipped through a narrow passage, its walls covered in hieroglyphs long forgotten. Nefara's heart pounded as she descended a hidden stairway, her fingers tracing symbols that pulsed under her touch. At the bottom, a heavy stone door stood ajar an invitation or a warning. Holding her breath, she stepped inside. The chamber beyond was unlike anything she had seen before. Torches flickered against the black stone walls, illuminating relics covered in gold and lapis lazuli. But in the center of it all, resting upon an obsidian pedestal, was an amulet that seemed to glow from within. Nefara felt her breath hitch as she stepped closer. The amulet was a deep shade of violet, its gemstone swirling as if a storm raged inside. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, almost alive. A whisper echoed in her mind, soft, unintelligible, yet strangely familiar. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Every part of her knew she should turn away, yet her body refused. The longer she stared, the more she felt it calling to her, as if it had waited for her all along. A sudden voice shattered the trance. "Step away, child." Nefara spun around, her heart leaping to her throat. An elderly priest stood at the entrance of the chamber, his piercing eyes filled with fear. His robes, once pristine, were streaked with dust, as if he had rushed here in desperation. "You do not understand what you touch," he warned, his voice firm but pleading. "That amulet is not a gift, it is a curse. Leave it where it lies." Nefara hesitated. A shiver ran down her spine, but still, her feet remained rooted. The amulet's whispers grew stronger, drowning out the priest's warnings. Her fingers reached forward, hovering over the gemstone. What harm could it bring, she thought. Before she could stop herself, she lifted it from its pedestal. The moment her fingers closed around it, a gust of wind surged through the chamber, snuffing out the torches. Darkness swallowed the room as a cold presence wrapped around her like unseen hands. The priest gasped, "You have doomed us all." Nefara awoke before the first light of dawn, her body drenched in sweat, her pulse erratic. The amulet still lay against her skin, cold as river stone, though the desert heat made the air thick and suffocating. She had dreamt of symbols glowing, shifting, rearranging themselves in ways she had never seen before. Yet when she opened her eyes, the meanings were clear in her mind, as if they had been etched into her very soul. Her father, a respected scribe, had always struggled to teach her the finer intricacies of hieroglyphic script. She could read, yes, but never with the ease or speed of the temple scholars. But now, as she sat beside him in the temple archives, her fingers traced the scrolls with an almost unnatural certainty. The texts whispered their secrets to her, the gods' words flowing effortlessly from her lips. A low murmur rose around her. The other scribes had gathered, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. She should have been proud, triumphant even. But as she turned the page, her hands trembled. This wasn't just learning, this was something else entirely. By midday, the rumors had spread beyond the temple walls. "The scribe's daughter," they whispered in the market. "She reads the sacred words, as if she wrote them herself." "A gift from Thoth," the priests murmured, though some exchanged wary glances. "Surely, she has been chosen." But not all believed it was divine intervention. An old merchant spat onto the ground, shaking his head. No mortal should possess such power overnight. Even her father, though proud, studied her with quiet concern. Nefara, he said gently that evening as they sat outside their small home, the amulet glinting against her collarbone. Men were not meant to touch. She looked down at the stone, feeling its weight. I have done nothing wrong. I hope you are right, he sighed, rubbing his temple. But the temple will watch you now. Be careful what you show them. His warning sent a ripple of unease through her. She had always dreamed of being noticed, of being more than just a scribe's daughter. But now that the eyes of Thebes were upon her, she wasn't sure she liked it. That night, she dreamed again. She stood in a chamber lined with gold, the scent of lotus and incense thick in the air. Braziers flickered, casting long shadows across the towering pillars. This was not her home. This was not Thebes. A polished bronze mirror stood before her, and she stepped closer, drawn to her reflection. But the woman staring back was not her. High cheekbones, darkly lined eyes, lips painted the color of crushed pomegranates. She wore a headdress of gold and onyx, a symbol of royalty. A queen. Nefara. The voice came not from her, but from within the amulet. She stumbled back, her breath catching. The walls around her rippled, distorting, shifting into something else, stone cracked with age, the scent of decay replacing the sweet perfumes. She turned, but the golden throne that had stood behind her was now crumbled, forgotten, swallowed by time. And then hands, dozens of them, clawing from the shadows, reaching for her. Nefara screamed. She woke with a gasp, the darkness of her small chamber pressing in around her. The amulet pulsed at her throat, almost like a heartbeat. The temple priest found her the next morning. He was the same man who had warned her in the hidden chamber. His robes were worn with age, his face etched with deep lines. Yet his eyes burned with something fierce, something almost desperate. "You have kept it," he said, his voice hoarse. It was not a question. Nefara's fingers instinctively curled around the amulet. "It is mine," he inhaled sharply. "Do you know what it is?" She hesitated. "An artifact of the gods." "No," he said. "It belonged to one who defied them." The word struck her like a slap. "That's not true." "Have you seen her yet?" His gaze sharpened. "Does she visit you in dreams?" Nefara's blood turned cold. She did not answer, but her silence was enough. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Neferuset." The name sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "She was once a queen," he continued. "A ruler unlike any other. But history has forgotten her, erased her. Do you know why?" Nefara shook her head, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "Because she was never meant to return." The priest stepped closer. "You must return the amulet." Number. The word left her lips before she could think. The idea of parting with it sent a rush of panic through her. "The amulet is not a gift," the priest pressed. "It is a vessel, a prison." Nefara's chest tightened. The whispers, the visions, was it true? Had she invited something into herself? "You do not understand what she was," the priest said, "or what she still is." A voice inside her whispered that she should listen, but another part stronger, bolder, rebelled. The amulet had made her powerful. It had made her more. "I will not give it up," she said firmly. The priest exhaled, the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. "Then the choice is no longer yours." As he turned and disappeared into the temple halls, a deep unease settled over Nefara. What had she awakened? The days that followed were a blur. The whispers in Nefara's mind no longer came only in dreams. Now, they slipped into her thoughts as she read, as she walked, as she breathed. At first, they were faint, like echoes from distant halls. Then they grew louder, clearer. "You are more than they believe you to be," the voice murmured, rich and smooth as flowing honey. "They fear what they do not understand." Nefara pressed a hand to her temple as she knelt before the temple scribes, copying ancient texts. The hieroglyphs shimmered, rearranging themselves before her eyes, showing meanings that should not have been possible. "Let me show you the truth," she gasped, her quill slipping from her fingers. A fellow scribe shot her a strange look. "Are you unwell?" Nefara swallowed, nodding quickly. "Yes, just tired." But she was not tired. She was changing. Despite her fear, she could not ignore what the amulet had given her. In a matter of days, she had risen in the ranks of the temple. Her mastery of the sacred texts surpassed that of men twice her age. Even the high priest, who once dismissed her as a mere scribe's daughter, now regarded her with wary respect. "You have a gift, Nefara," he said one morning as they stood before the towering statue of Thoth. "But gifts come with responsibility." The other priests murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others avoiding her gaze altogether. She could feel their unease. They feared her, and she liked it. Then the blackouts began. One evening, Nefara found herself standing at the banks of the Nile, her feet sinking into wet sand. She had no memory of walking there. The sky was black, the stars reflected on the rippling water. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. How did I get here? The amulet pulsed against her skin. Had it brought her here? Had she sleepwalked through the city without realizing it? Shaking, she turned back toward Thebes, but as she did, a flash of movement caught her eye. A shadow stood at the water's edge, watching her. She staggered back, but when she blinked, it was gone. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Nile's waters had receded overnight, leaving cracked riverbeds where crops should have thrived. Livestock grew sick. The air in the temple felt heavier, as though the gods themselves were holding their breath. "The gods are angry," an old woman whispered in the marketplace. "Something unnatural walks among us." Nefara's stomach twisted. At the temple, a scribe muttered a prayer under his breath as she passed. A priest avoided her gaze entirely. Even her father seemed distant, his once warm eyes filled with unspoken worry. She had wanted power. She had not wanted to be feared. Had she? The priest who had warned her before approached her again, his face drawn with urgency. "It is worsening," he said. "You must remove it." Nefara clenched her fists. "I can control it." "Number." His voice was sharp. "You do not understand what is happening. The more you use it, the more it takes from you." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, she knew. The voice in her mind, the one she had started to trust, was growing stronger. She wasn't sure it was hers anymore. That night, she ventured to the temple's oldest chamber, where hieroglyphs stretched across the walls, untouched by time. She traced them with her fingertips, and they moved beneath her touch. The voice in her head purred in satisfaction. "You are remembering." The carvings told a story of a queen who had ruled with wisdom and power beyond measure, a queen whose name had been erased from history. Neferuset. The moment the name formed in her mind, the walls glowed. The chamber trembled. Sand trickled from the ceiling. She stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What had she done? From that night on, the shadows followed her. They lurked in the corners of rooms, stretching unnaturally long at dusk. They flickered along the temple walls, twisting and shifting even when no light touched them. At first, she ignored them. But then, one moved, and it smiled. Nefara's blood ran cold. She ran. The last thing she remembered was standing in the temple, staring at her reflection in a polished bronze mirror. Then nothing. When she awoke, her hands were streaked with something dark. The scent of copper filled her nose. Blood. She stumbled back, gasping. The amulet burned against her chest. Her vision swam as she saw her reflectionally. It wasn't her. It was Neferuset. Smiling. Nefara gasped as she jolted awake, her heart pounding. She was no longer in the temple. Instead, she stood at the edge of a vast desert, the wind howling around her. Sand whipped against her skin, but she felt no pain, no fear. The amulet pulsed against her chest, a steady rhythm, a heartbeat that was not her own. It is time. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, commanding, alive. Nefara turned her head, but the movement did not feel like her own. Her body was stiff, her limbs slow, as if she were walking through water. A shiver crawled up her spine. She tried to speak, but her lips did not move. She was trapped. Somewhere inside her, Neferuset laughed. The city of Thebes trembled beneath an unnatural storm. Winds tore through the streets, knocking over baskets and ripping linen from the market stalls. People screamed, running for shelter. The temple shook, their pillars groaning under an invisible weight. At the heart of it all stood Nefara, what remained of her. Neferuset had returned. Her voice, low and ancient, echoed through the temple halls as she stepped forward. The priests, gathered in desperation, bowed their heads in fear. They knew what she was, what she had been. "You have forgotten me," she said, her voice like silk laced with venom. "But I have not forgotten you." Dark clouds blotted out the sun, casting the city into unnatural twilight. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very gods held their breath. The Nile, once calm, raged with an unseen force. The waters churned, rising, as if reaching for the sky. Thunder cracked, shaking the stones beneath the people's feet. Neferuset raised a hand, and the ground trembled. Sand curled into the air, twisting into unnatural shapes. The temple bells rang in alarm. The city was hers to command. And yet deep within the prison of her own mind, Nefara fought. Nefara could feel the weight of Neferuset's presence pushing down on her, drowning her thoughts, her will. But she was not gone. Not yet. She clawed at the edges of her consciousness, pushing against the force that bound her. "This is my body." Neferuset laughed, her voice ringing through the void. "You are nothing, little scribe. A vessel, a shell. You do not belong here." But Nefara did not stop fighting. Images flickered before her Aishur father's worried gaze. The temple where she had spent her childhood. The people who now cowered in fear. This was her home, not Neferuset's. The queen's grip wavered, and Nefara struck. As their minds clashed, memories flooded through Nefera memories that were not hers. She saw Neferuset standing before an army, her people kneeling before her. She had ruled with wisdom, with strength, but she had also been feared. The priests, jealous of her power, had betrayed her. They had sealed her away, erasing her name, her legacy. "I was not a monster," Neferuset whispered. "I was a queen," Nefara faltered. The pain in Neferuset's voice was real, raw. Could she be saved? The temple priest, the one who had warned Nefara all along, stepped forward. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "You were a queen," he said, "but you were never meant to return." Neferuset narrowed her eyes. "You would erase me again?" The priest swallowed hard. "You do not belong in this time." Neferuset raised a hand, and the storm grew fiercer. Lightning struck the temple steps, sending sparks into the air. The people screamed. The priest turned to Nefarath, real Nefara, trapped inside. "You can stop this," he urged. "But you must make a choice." Nefara's mind was splitting, torn between two fates. Neferuset's power surged through her veins, intoxicating, unstoppable. She could keep it rule as a queen reborn, or she could fight, destroy the amulet, lose everything. The city's cries echoed in her ears. Her father, the temple, Thebes itself. She knew what she had to do. Taking a deep breath, she focused all her strength on the amulet, gripping it in her hands. "Let me go," she whispered. Neferuset screamed. The amulet cracked. The amulet pulsed violently, heat searing through Nefara's palm. The crack that had formed in its surface deepened, glowing like molten gold. Wind howled around her, carrying Neferuset's enraged scream through the temple halls. "You would destroy me?" The queen's voice thundered inside her mind, laced with betrayal. "After all I have given you?" Tears burned in Nefara's eyes. Power was intoxicating. Power was freedom. But it was not hers to wield, not like this. She had seen what Neferuset had done to Thebes, and now she saw what she had almost become. If she did not stop this now, there would be no turning back. She closed her fingers around the amulet and squeezed. "Wait!" Neferuset's voice wavered. The storm outside flickered, hesitating. The ground beneath Nefara's feet steadied. "You do not understand," the queen whispered. "I was betrayed. I was erased. They feared me, so they locked me away." Images surged through Nefara's mind. Neferuset kneeling before the temple priests, pleading for her life. They had stripped her of her name, her kingdom, her people. They had cast her into darkness, leaving only the amulet as her prison. "I only wanted justice." Nefara faltered. Was Neferuset truly the monster history had painted her to be? Or had she simply fought too hard to claim her place? Could she be freed? The amulet burned brighter, its golden cracks spreading like veins of fire. The priest stepped forward, his voice urgent. "You must destroy it now, Nefara, or she will consume you." Neferuset's voice softened. "You don't have to do this." For a moment, doubt crept into Nefara's heart. The queen was not entirely evil. She had been wronged, betrayed. But power had changed her. Would it not do the same to Nefara? The shadows around her lengthened, the storm outside rumbling once more. The queen was lying. She was only stalling, waiting to regain her strength. Nefara's fingers tightened. She made her choice. With all the strength left in her, Nefara slammed the amulet against the temple floor. The crack split wide open, and a burst of golden light exploded outward. A scream, Neferuset's scream, pierced the air, shaking the very foundation of the temple. The storm outside howled in agony as the queen's essence, trapped for centuries, was torn apart. The wind died. The air stilled. The shadows melted away. And then silence. Nefara collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The amulet was no more. Only fragments of gold and obsidian remained, smoldering in the dust. Neferuset was gone. The moment the amulet shattered, Thebes seemed to exhale. The sky cleared. The heavy weight in the air lifted. The river, once restless, calmed. The people of the city emerged from their homes, hesitant, fearful. Had the nightmare truly ended? At the temple steps, the priest stood frozen, staring at Nefara in stunned silence. She had done what they could not. But something was different. Nefara could feel it in her bones, a hollowness, an absence. The power that had coursed through her veins was gone. The whispers had faded. She was no longer extraordinary. She was just herself. She had won. So why did it feel like she had lost something too? The priest knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You did what had to be done. Nefara swallowed hard, staring at the broken remains of the amulet. She wasn't all evil, she whispered. She was just forgotten. The priest sighed. History is written by those who survive it. But she will never be forgotten now. Nefara's gaze flickered to the temple walls, to the ancient inscriptions carved into stone. The hieroglyphs of Neferuset's story had been erased long ago, but perhaps one day, someone would carve them anew. Perhaps her story was not meant to vanish completely. And perhaps neither was Nefara's. As the sun began to set over Thebes, Nefara stood at the edge of the desert. The fragments of the amulet lay in her palm, cool now, lifeless. She knelt in the sand and began to dig. The desert had always been a place of secrets, of things lost to time, and so she would return the amulet to its resting place, where no one could ever find it again. She covered it with sand, pressing her hand over the mound. For a moment, she thought she heard a whisper. Then silence. She stood, brushing the dust from her hands. Thebes awaited her, and though she no longer carried power, she carried something else's story worth remembering. With one final glance at the horizon, Nefara turned and walked away.